Introducing our lovely author, Deborah Goodrich Royce, who's with us here today. And just a bit about her. So Deborah began her career as an actress, starring as Silver Kane, sister of the legendary Erica Kane, on the ABC soap All My Children. She went on to star in feature films such as April Fool's Day and Just One of the Guys, and several TV movies and series such as Beverly Hills, 90210, and 21 Jump Street. That's it. She worked as a reader for Studio Canal Plus in Paris. Ooh. In the 1990s, Deborah was a story editor at the Miramax Films in New York. There she oversaw readers, manuscript acquisitions, and script development, editing such notable screenplays such as Emma by Doug McGrath and early versions of Chicago and A Wrinkle in Time. Deborah won a grant from the Massachusetts Arts Council in 2002 to develop and workshop their original screenplay, Taft Has Run Amok. Deborah serves on the governing boards of the New York Botanical Garden, the Greenwich Historical Society, and the Prasad Project, and the advisory boards of the American Film Institute. Wow, the Greenwich International Film Festival, the Preservation Society of Newport County, and the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach. She is a former trustee of the YWCA of Greenwich and the Garden Conservatory. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Deborah Goodrich Royce.
I'll take that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, where's Christina, thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. I am so glad to be here to talk to you about my Florida book. And there's a great quotation that some people have attributed to Carl Hiaasen as having said about Florida, but I think it was actually Somerset Maugham who said it about the French Riviera back in the 1920s, a sunny place for shady people. And that was the tone that I wanted to capture with Reef Road. I love Florida. I've been coming here ever since I got on an airplane in 4th grade and flew to visit my aunt and uncle in Hallandale, and on to when I would fly into the Fort Lauderdale airport that was outside. If you're old enough, you can remember. And my grandparents lived in an area called Tamarack, which at that time was just part of Fort Lauderdale. I think it's its own section now. So when the pandemic shut us down, and for me, I really date it to March 13th, 2020. I say that it was a Friday. It was my granddaughter Annabelle's first birthday, and they were visiting us. We were at our house in Palm Beach, and if you remember, there was that weird moment of what exactly is happening here. Were we going to have cake? Were we going to have people come over? What was going on in the world? Well, we all now know exactly what was going on in the world. And I had been on a book tour for Finding Mrs. Ford, the Aqua cover right there. And of course, naturally, that came to a crashing halt. And here I was in Florida with my husband, my dog, my daughter, my son-in-law, my granddaughter, and their 2 dogs. So we're in this house with all these people and 3 dogs. And I will confess that I am the tidiest person in my family. And if you live in a house with 3 dogs in a pandemic shutdown where nobody is helping you to sweep the floors, we suddenly had dog hair tumbleweed kind of moving down the hardwood floors. And I thought, we're going to have a completely different kind of murder mystery here because I'm going to kill somebody. And I got a Roomba, and I named my Roomba Orlando, because if you look at my middle book there, Ruby Falls, which is a little bit more of a gothic thriller, it's very evocative of Rebecca, if you remember Rebecca, and the male protagonist, who's a very dishy fellow. All of my male protagonists are somewhat exotic to sort of this garden variety, middle-aged white woman. So Orlando is Anglo-Chinese. His name is Orlando Montague. So he's quite a handsome fellow. And so I named my Roomba Orlando after him in the second book. And I started at that point to research a very dark story in our family. And so I'm going to jump right in. On December the 10th, 1948, my mother was 12. She was growing up in an area of Pittsburgh called Homewood Brushton. Anybody from Pittsburgh here? So this is a working class urban neighborhood, row houses. The kids, everybody lived in these attached houses side to side. Kids walked to school. And this was a Friday. My mom and her friend Carol, who were both 12, walked home from school that day, and they had two discussions. One was, were they going to show up to practice for the Christmas pageant that was going on at their church that weekend? And two, would my mother go to Carol's house that night? Carol's parents were going out bowling, and they were leaving her home alone. Not such an unusual choice in 1948. I think parents routinely did that. And for whatever reason, my grandmother changed her mind. She was going to let my mom go to Carol's house and decided not to. So Carol was trackable from 8:30 when her parents left the house, and the father was later adamant that he had instructed her to keep the front door and the back door locked. And her motions were knowable till about 9:30. She made 2 phone calls in that period. She called my mother, and she called another girl's house twice. She reached the girl, and then at 9:30, she reached the girl's mother. The mother was very precise that it was 9:30 because she had just sent her daughter to the market to buy milk. Again, not an unusual choice in a city in 1948 to send a 12-year-old out at 9:30 at night to go shopping. From 9:30 to 11:30, it is really less known what went on in the house. We do know that she was baking a cake. There was all kinds of paraphernalia on the kitchen counter to bake what turned out to be a chocolate cake. But we don't really know the timeline of the evening. The parents returned at 11:30. That is known because a neighbor observed them returning. There was a strange lag of time, 21 minutes, between the return of the parents and when the next 2 things happened. The father called the police, and the mother ran outside screaming. When they had returned, they had found a trail of blood from the kitchen. They found the back door unlocked and a trail of blood from the kitchen to the dining room, where Carol was found collapsed next to the telephone table, having been stabbed 36 times. And it has remained an unsolved crime to this day. The holes in timeline, the mistakes that were made around the case, the thing it reminds me of most in our era is the John Benet Ramsey case. That, of course, was covered, it went viral, as we would now say, and it was covered everywhere. When I decided to do the research, March of 2020, I'm sitting in my house here in Florida, and I thought, I'm going to finally do that research. So the first thing was that there was a tremendous amount of material available on the internet. I don't know who the gremlins are who upload old newspaper articles to the internet, but they do it, and they did it in this case. So there were years of newspapers available to look at. And it did become very evident. There was great confusion and I would even say chaos around this case. There were a bunch of people running around Pittsburgh who called themselves citizen detectives. This is a term that we would now use somewhat respectfully. It's, because we all know about true crime now. There are TV shows, there are podcasts. We know about citizen detectives. They were not so well known. And that added to kind of this bungling atmosphere. There was one woman, it added also this element of farce. So this very dark and terrible story started to seem somewhat ridiculous. One of the women who was running around arresting in the case, it was the brother. Primary suspicion fell on one brother. She had two, but one was 19 years old, 7 years older. And one of the people who arrested him was a woman who was referred to as a pistol-packing sweater girl. And I like to say to younger people who don't know what a sweater girl was, that means she looked nice in a sweater. So she was involved in that. There were these other people. So the whole thing was a mess, very hard to disentangle. I happen to know that the case was reopened in 2008 at the 60-year anniversary. I happen to know this because I have a friend who ran the New York State Prosecutors Training Institute out of Albany. And just based on a casual conversation, he became interested in the case. As I told him about it, he paused and said, it was the brother. And I was shocked for a minute because I thought he actually knew about the case, but that wasn't it. He was just venturing that anyone who stabs another human being 36 times has something personal going on with the victim. So he, this fellow, spoke to the Pittsburgh Police Department. They opened the file on the brother. There were some negative things in the file, including the fact that the brother happened to have something of a history as a flasher and some arrests for that, which of course doesn't make you a murderer. I understand that. It indicates perhaps a lack of impulse control. They sent, in Pittsburgh, they sent a bunch of rookies down to the property room and they found a box of fabric, at which point they got very excited because you can imagine a bunch of detectives in 2008 when DNA evidence was really pretty new. They thought they might have a 60-year-old DNA conviction. They sent the box to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia. They brought the brother in for questioning 3 times, always in the company of his wife. She came with him. He failed his polygraph. Again, that doesn't mean he did it. We all understand that. But there was a very strange moment in the middle of all this questioning where the wife turned to the husband and started screaming and asking him if he did this, which I guess a bunch of detectives thought this guy must have done it. But at the end of the day, the fabric came back degraded. There was no DNA that was retrievable on it, and the case was dropped again. Now, I recently, a few months ago, did an event with David Baldacci, if you know him. He's written like 3 million thrillers. And we were chatting about this. He said, there's advanced DNA technology. But it is actually not my goal to bring down that brother or really engage the real family in this way. I wasn't there. I wasn't alive yet. I don't really know what happened. And what I really wanted to explore when I began my examination was the concept of generational trauma, or conferred trauma, if you will. Trauma that isn't necessarily ours, but it becomes ours. We didn't actually go through the event. And I've done a lot of reading on a subject called epigenetics, and it turns out we absorb trauma at a genetic level. It plays out in the large, sweeping cultural events. The 3 biggies: the Holocaust, the enslavement of Black Americans, the genocide of Native Americans. Those are like the mega cultural events where trauma passes down. I don't know how, I'm not a scientist, but people carry that. Levels of depression, anxiety, whichever way you want to look at it. I think there's a lot of research to be done, and perhaps we will come to a greater understanding at some point about things like addiction, depression, anxiety. I can't speak about that, though, because I don't really have the knowledge. But what I do know is my mother's best friend was murdered. My mother was affected by it, and I was affected by it. Now, spoiler alert, my mom is alive and well in Boynton Beach, right up the road. So I do want to tell you, or I'm in trouble if I don't tell you, when I fictionalized this and created a writer obsessed with the murder of her mother's best friend, I promise you I made the writer and her mother a lot crazier than we are. So if you ever meet my mom, please do tell her I told you that. So as I was looking at it, and I did for a brief period consider writing nonfiction, but nonfiction is completely bound up in facts. Nothing wrong with facts, but I wanted to explore an overarching truth that wasn't so much tied up with the facts, this idea that we carry trauma in this way. And an example of a fact that turned out not to be very helpful to my story, in my first version, when a friend read it, I did have faithfully the two brothers of the real murdered girl. And my friend said, "What's with the second brother? It's confusing." Well, because I'm fictionalizing it, we could just exit second brother stage left immediately. We didn't have to keep him in the picture. So I'm in Palm Beach. It's that whole COVID lockdown. I'm researching this murder. I'm deciding to fictionalize it, but I like very complicated, non-linear stories, and I always like a good twist. If you've read my earlier books, every single one of my books has a twist. And if you don't know the difference between a reveal and a twist, think about an Agatha Christie locked room mystery. We're all in this room. One of us gets murdered. One of us didn't. It's revealed at a certain point who did it. So fine, you figure it out, but it's not a huge, knock you off your chair moment. A twist is when you're going along thinking that one thing is happening in the book or the film, as the case may be, when all of a sudden it's turned on its head and you realize something altogether different is going on. And that's what I've been able to write for 3 books. So in creating what I wanted to be a twisty thriller, I made a couple decisions. One, I decided to set it in Palm Beach in the COVID lockdown. This book is not about COVID. You're not going into a huge treatise on what I think politically, on what I think medically, because you don't care. But it's a setting. And the purpose of that setting, first of all, we were living through it, and I was writing it then. And there's a great adage for writers. If you just write what's going on every day, you're writing history. So we lived through that. It was living history. And also, Alice McDermott, the wonderful writer who wrote Charming Billy, she talks about one of the differences between nonfiction and fiction. She said, in nonfiction, you need to include everything. You must, you're compelled. But in fiction, because the possibilities are infinite, it is the writer's job to actually put a box around it. You have to limit it. You have to leave things out. And COVID, in the case of a thriller, is a pretty nifty box to place around your characters. Think about it. If you pick up a book that's set in 1944 Paris, you know instantly, without the author telling you anything, certain limitations that are existing around your characters. So I think the spring of 2020 served the story very well. So I'm writing and researching in the morning, making all my notes, and I'm riding my bike around the desolate lunar landscape of Palm Beach. Lunar landscape is not a very appropriate way to say it because it's so beautiful. Twilight Zone, let's put it that way. It looked like everybody had been raptured. There's nobody on the street. There were yellow police tapes at all the beaches, which those make their way into the book. And I'm thinking about the story of another woman. And I've decided she's going to be an American woman, younger, to me, 40 is younger. And she's married now to a very dishy husband from Argentina, whose name is Miguel Alonso. And I'm thinking, where can I put Linda and Miguel? And I'm looking at all these street names. And of course, you live in Florida. They're pretty names like Dolphin or Banyan or Hibiscus. And I come across Reef Road. And I think that is just too good because it's a great name. It has that alliterative quality, but it also implies a certain peril, like a coral reef. You could run aground. So I decide to set Linda and her husband and their 2 little children on Reef Road. And then I discover, as we were discussing earlier, that Reef Road is a famous surf beach, which now that makes its way into the story. So the pieces are coming together into what Reef Road is. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. Reef Road is a very twisty dual narrative of 2 women, a writer who is researching the murder of her mother's best friend and is wildly obsessed with murder in general. And you will get far more murder statistics than you may want. And her chapters are very internal. They're like diary entries, and you are in her obsessive brain, if we can call it that. They alternate with chapters that read like a book within a book, and those are called The Wife. And that is about Linda and her husband, Miguel, and the fact that 3 weeks into the COVID lockdown, Miguel and their 2 little children disappear. And the police track down the family car to the long-term parking lot at Miami International Airport, and they discover security camera footage of Miguel and the 2 children in their face masks getting on a plane for Buenos Aires. Linda cannot follow. And why can't she follow? Because of the pandemic. I don't know how I would have prevented her from following if we didn't have that quarantine. So the novel toggles back and forth between these 2 women in that crazy time on the island of Palm Beach. And bit by bit by bit, you come to unravel what one woman has to do with the other. I had the opportunity to go on CNN in January to talk about this book because it really is based on a true crime. And this is how I'm going to tie you back into my life. So as I was getting ready for my big CNN appearance, they knew I had been an actress, and they knew I had done the original miniseries with Mark Harmon about Ted Bundy. And I played the woman who married Bundy, and they said, get us footage. So imagine trying to find footage of a 1986 miniseries. And there I am on the internet, madly Googling around, and I finally come across something. It's called something like Marcy's Movies. And dear sweet Marcy uploaded her VHS home recording, grainy. So I go through it for 3-4 hours trying to, stop frame, because you have to get your footage absolutely precisely. They didn't use any of it. But let's take it back. So my mom, as you know, is from Pittsburgh. My dad was from Tennessee, and I grew up in Michigan. Michigan was one of those gathering places where people came for jobs. They came from Eastern Europe, all around the world, and in the US, they came from the South. For Black people, it was the Great Migration, and for white people, they called it the Hillbilly Highway. So my parents met in Detroit, married, had me. That's where I grew up. I went to college in Eastern Ohio and did a junior year in Paris, but because I was in a very small school, I always acted, and I was a dance minor. So the summer before my senior year, a movie came to town. It was a big United Artists picture with Frank Langella, he's still acting, and Tom Hulse. He has quit acting, he's directing, but he played Mozart in Amadeus, if you remember him. He was wonderful. So this movie was called Those Lips, Those Eyes, which sounds a little off color. It wasn't. That is a lyric from a song. And the movie was about summer stock theater at the turn of the last century, in the early 20th century. And I was hired as a background dancer. And I got to wear a Bob Mackie dress, which sounds, very sexy, Cher. It had a big ruffled collar and huge sleeves and a big skirt. And I danced in this old New York Dutch girl number. But the choreographer was very friendly, and he kept saying, you should come to New York and audition for me. Well, I'm from the Midwest, so I'm very literal. So I thought he literally meant I should come to New York and audition for him. So I finished college early. I was in a hurry for I know not what. I'm back in Detroit. I'm working in some office. And I pick up a copy of Variety one day at a local bookstore. And Variety was the theatrical publication. And there in the back is a notice that this fellow is holding auditions at the Minskoff Theater in New York City. So I pick up the phone. I'm like, hi, it's Deborah Goodrich. You said I should come audition for you. He said, yeah, I can't really guarantee you anything. I said, well, that's okay. So I moved to New York the next day, which sounds very dramatic now that we're all grown-ups and we have households. I didn't have a household. I had 2 suitcases, and there was Mrs. Blakely, who lived in New York. She was the widow of the head of our theater department, who had died at age 45 of an aneurysm, and she was in shock and grief, and she'd gone to New York. So I went and stayed with Mrs. Blakely. And the very first threshold I crossed in New York was that of the Minskoff Theater at 1515 Broadway. I'm emphasizing that because I want you to hold that thought. Jump 40 years into the future, 4 decades. In January of 2021, my publisher called me and about Ruby Falls, which was about to come out in May. He said, do you want a triple electronic billboard in Times Square? Now, naturally, my question was, how much is that going to cost? Because, you know, the writer pays for everything. There's a tally sheet. And he said, $3,500. I said, how much does that normally cost? He said, a couple $100,000. So I got off the phone and I thought, you know, $3,500 is real money. Got it. But a couple $100,000. And when else am I going to have a triple electronic billboard in Times Square? I think I should do this. I think I'm going to do it. So I say yes. So at the end of April, the day comes around. Now it's still COVID lockdown in New York. Broadway's closed. That's why it's so cheap. Because everything's closed. Restaurants are closed, theaters are closed. So nobody's going to see it on the street, but it's a social media opportunity. So my girlfriends and I, we get in a car, we drive to New York. We're just standing there like tourists looking around. And you know where I'm going with this. These huge, many, many times larger than life size, glowing electronic billboards of me and my book are right above the door to the Minskoff Theater at 1515 Broadway. And I got very teary. And I thought, you know, if an angel had parted the heavens and said to me 40 years ago, this is a long time, people, listen, sweetheart, this isn't going to work out for you today. But don't worry, 40 years from now, if you work hard, keep it together, put one foot in front of the other, pick yourself up when you fall down, you will be back here in a way you cannot even imagine. I would not have believed it. And I am a mother, as you know, and a grandmother. And if I will get weepy again, if there is any lesson I could give to my children, my grandchildren, all the children out there, I would say, have a little faith that things are going somewhere, even if you just can't understand where. So now I'm really going to speed it up. So going back, I was not cast in the production that I auditioned for that day at the Minskoff Theater. I spent about a year pursuing a dance career, didn't quite make it, and thought, well, I'll just try acting before I apply to graduate school. And I had a really different experience as an actress. I started booking a lot of commercials, you know, big Coca-Cola, Visine, bacon-flavored Cheetos, which you've never heard of because they were so bad. Weight Watchers, all these things. And within a year, I got that big break, the sister of Erica Kane on All My Children. And it was one of those moments in life that don't come along very often because we, of course, learn better. But it was a moment where I thought, I've made it. That's it. I have nothing to worry about the rest of my life. That's it. Well, I was written out a year later. My character was sent to prison where she rots to this day because I was so bad. And that is a very complicated thing to play as a young actress. I played such a twisted, messed up, evil, conniving, manipulative character. And all of this was to undermine Erica, who was the star of all stars. So off my character went to prison. And within a few months, Paramount Pictures flew me out to LA to screen test for a pilot with Christopher Lloyd. If you remember him, Back to the Future and Taxi. And that was another, oh, this is so wonderful moment. You know, they flew me on coach. They put me in the Hollywood Holiday Inn, but I was so excited. So I had a really nice 10-year run as an actress. It was a beautiful time of life. And toward the end of it, got married and had 2 little girls. And the bloom was off that rose by that point. These were the olden days before technology. So I would get a call at 6 o'clock in the evening to drive an hour to pick up a script. And you know, when you have toddlers, 6 o'clock in the evening is kind of the witching hour. You don't want to go on a 2-hour drive. So my first husband, who was an American who'd grown up in Paris, had the opportunity to go back to France and work on a project, which I was thrilled to do. So I kind of went grieving my acting career because I knew that was over. And this funny other door opened. I was hired as a reader, as you mentioned, by a French film studio, not for reading French manuscripts. They were investing money in British and American films, and they wanted kind of the native take. Let's see what the local thinks. So that was kind of a cool job. You know, it was freelance, and I would read manuscripts and synopsize them and write a page of comments, and I did that for a couple of years. And then we moved back to the States because my first husband took a job to work for Julia Roberts. She had a deal at Disney. And I was hired by, and I always pause to let you absorb, Harvey Weinstein to be the story editor at Miramax Films. What I will say about that, I don't disbelieve the women and I don't condone his behavior, but I have a huge debt of gratitude to him. He gave me a huge opportunity to sit in that editorial chair as a former actress, and I learned a lot, and I didn't have that experience of him. Again, I'm not doubting it, but part of what I write, I call my books identity thrillers, because I think the most interesting puzzle in the world is a question of who people are. And I think we all have secrets. Most of our secrets are quite benign. It wouldn't make any difference in the world if somebody found out about them. But occasionally, there are the Ted Bundys, there are the Harvey Weinsteins, and not everybody knows about it. And I think it's going to be a very long, decades, centuries-long conversation about how we reconcile the entirety of a human being. So I worked at Miramax in the 90s, and I call that my writing school. When you are editing the writing of far greater writers, you better pay close attention. So I ended up going through a pretty shattering divorce, not my choice, which I hope remains the lowest point in my life. And a few years after that, met and remarried. And that began this latest chapter. My darling husband, as we were about to be married, he said, you know, there's this movie theater that's closed in Stamford, Connecticut. You were in the movie business. Let's restore this movie theater. And I was a total brat. I said, I don't really know anything about that aspect of the movie business. He said, oh, come on, it'll be fun. And it has been. And in that project, we became friends with Gene Wilder. He lived in Stamford, and he got very involved with the Avon for 10 years. He would come and present movies. And in our friendship, he said to me at a certain point, are you a writer? I think you're a writer. Guess what? I had been writing secretly, and I know there are secret writers in the room. I was in writing groups. I'd written a screenplay. I'd gotten a grant, but I said nothing about it. And so Gene Wilder offered to read something. I showed him this manuscript, and every time I saw him after that, he'd say, are you writing? I hope you're writing. You should be writing. So the magic moment for me was 2014. I was in my mid-50s, empty nest, and my youngest, who had been my worry child, and I don't think any of you have a worry child, I think it's only me. She was grown and flown, and I felt this mental expansiveness. I felt like I got the real estate in my brain back. I adore my children, but for me, it was very consuming to raise kids. I could always work while I was raising children, but I couldn't really do that deep dive of writing novels. So I had an idea. I started telling my friends I'm writing a novel. And again, my dear husband, he's like, oh, I really wouldn't say that to people if I were you. I said, you know what? I do understand that it might not happen. I get it that 2 years from now, people might say, hey, whatever happened to your novel? And I might have to say nothing. But I actually I knew myself, and I started changing my life. And I started reorganizing my time. And about 7 months into it, a dear friend of mine who was a writer for Essence magazine, she's written 7 books on African American culture, nonfiction, like Jumping the Broom, which is about marriage traditions in the Black American world. Her name's Harriet Cole. So Harriet says to me one day, how's your book going, Deborah? I said, it's going great, Harriet. She said, how many days a week are you writing? I said, I'm writing 1 day a week. And she said, you are never going to finish your book. So I thought, I need to change everything. And I did. So here we are. Well, that's 9 years later. I just published my 3rd book. I've ended up in this space, like I said, of identity thrillers. If I were to look at a body of work that I would find aspirational, and I switch between film and book references all the time, I would look at a body of work like an Alfred Hitchcock, those kinds of thrillers where you're very engaged in the puzzle and what's unfolding. And here we are. I think it's time for questions. So Reef Road is my first national bestseller, which is very exciting. And they have been, so Finding Mrs. Ford was optioned for the actress Gillian Anderson. She played Maggie Thatcher in The Crown, and she was on FX. But that project has just fallen apart. So we'll see. You know, there's a long life. The last thing I'll say, when I was at Miramax, I worked on A Wrinkle in Time. I was the editor. So this is the mid-90s. This is a book that was written in the early 60s. So 30 years later, it's on my desk. And the original writer, Madeleine L'Engle, had given it to her goddaughter and her goddaughter's husband to write. And tragically, the husband died at age 40 all of a sudden. And I would have told you then this project is dead. 20 years after that, the Black American female director, Ava DuVernay, made that movie with a multiracial cast, and I could cry again because it was very awe-inspiring and humbling. Again, this 50-year trajectory from book to movie. And I would have told you in my teeny little moment of touching that project, this is never going to happen. But there's more going on than we understand. So I'd love to take questions. Any questions? Yes.
So how much time do you spend writing now? Are you writing something now?
Yes, I am writing something now. So I've been on a pretty active book tour for 5 months, and this is like a big wrap-up week. I started something last summer. I got a weird email from a guy who said, hey, remember me?
The casting director?
He said, I was your best boy in Survival Game. So that's kind of a provocative sentence, because what does that mean? Well, a best boy is the head electrician in a movie, so it's a real job. Survival Game was a movie I did with Mike Norris, who's the son of Chuck Norris, that action star. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I did that movie. Still don't remember the guy. He said, you remember that Thanksgiving dinner we had together? He said, you were the only actress that nobody came to see on the set that week. And I'm thinking, well, now how does he know that about me? Because I still don't remember this guy. And then he wraps it up by saying, Do you remember when we saw each other at the Cannes Film Festival? You were standing there holding a baby, waving at me, and I wondered for a moment if the child was mine. But I knew that couldn't be possible. And now I'm thinking, well, I really hope that's not possible, because I really hope we didn't have that kind of a relationship, because I have zero memory. But I got to thinking about memory and how flawed it can be, and this is not an original subject. And I thought about, what if you have a woman with some flaws in her memory and a man who approaches her with certain correct points of data about her life? And what if he's telling the truth? And what if he's not? And right now I'm calling it best boy. I have his email somewhere, and then somebody said, well, are you going to tell that guy? And I thought, well, maybe I'd better. Yes. So I've lived in New York in different periods. I lived there from 1980 to 1984. Then I lived there again, I'm going to say 93 to 96. And then I've lived outside of New York since then. So I'm in New York all the time, but I'm going in by train rather than living there. Did you live in New York?
I lived in New York for 37 years.
Okay.
37 years.
37, yeah.
I'm from Jamaica originally.
Yeah.
I came here March 8, 1983.
Wow.
But I'm retired now. My last job was at LaGuardia Airport.
Oh, I see. But so you're a Floridian now.
Yeah, I was a security officer at LaGuardia.
Wow.
Security officer.
So there might be someone like you in Reef Road when they go to the airport. I did think the whole airport thing was intriguing in COVID.
Mayor Edward Koch was mayor. He usually carries paycheck. Edward Koch.
I remember him. Yes. I loved him.
I drive for the U.S. Open. I drive David Dinkins.
Loved him too. Well, you have the New York history. Wow. Any other questions? Yes.
First of all, you had a fascinating, very interesting, diverse life, and it's very interesting. I've read all three of your books, and I enjoyed them all. I did, and they're all very, very different. And I think that I can feel, knowing a little bit about you now, perhaps from different times
Right.
for each one of them, because they're very different. And I could see the growth in them. But I enjoyed them all. I think they kept my interest. You know, you can get off the They kept my interest. I kept wanting
Thank
to
you.
go back to it.
Thank you. Well, that's very nice. Yeah, she's going to go on the road with me. She's a plant. That's my sister. Yeah. Thank you. I so appreciate it. I really do. Well, you know, it's funny because on Amazon and Goodreads, the positive comments are always very appreciated because there are people who go on tears and you think, really? Is that necessary? You know, okay.
I just think that you became more real with your live discussion. But I could see all three books, which are very different. But there's definitely threads of you.
That's right. And that's why I don't do my audiobooks because people say, well, you're an actress. Why don't you do your audiobooks? I'm like, I don't want people to think these are autobiographical because these things didn't actually happen to me because there are some wild things that happen in each book. But I think we do use pieces of ourselves. And that's another interesting question. So cultural appropriation, how do you write characters who aren't like you? I've written an Iraqi man, an Anglo-Chinese man, an Argentine man. I'm none of those things. And I've never been so bold as to make them my main character and my complete point of view. I think that might be challenging. But also, I'm not going to write a book with just 15 middle-aged white women. And I'm very generous when I call myself middle-aged. Don't correct me. So there's a fine line. You can't just write a book with 15 people like you. You've got to have different genders and different, as best you can, and then how do you do it? I mean, I rely on acting, and so I used an Iraqi Chaldean in Finding Mrs. Ford. It's a story of a woman whose past catches up with her, a woman of great wealth who didn't come from great wealth, and it goes from this coastal New England, bucolic seaside community back to her college years in Detroit, where she takes a pretty sketchy job in a pretty sketchy disco. So the Iraqi Chaldeans are an interesting group. They're Catholics from the north of Iraq. And in August of 2014, we first started hearing about them in the news because ISIS was marauding over the north of Iraq and killing a lot of Iraqi Chaldeans. And I thought, oh my goodness, I knew Iraqi Chaldeans when I was in Detroit. They're a huge population there. Again, many roads have led to Detroit for jobs, and people go where they know people. So I research, and then I just tried to write what I thought was a real human being. And I was very pleased to hear from some Iraqi Chaldeans in Detroit who liked the book and liked the portrayal. So, but it's a tricky one. Yes?
I was very, very sympathetic. I forget the names of the characters now. The mother, Linda, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the mother. Yeah. And then when she had the affair with the...
She had an affair. Yeah, we're not going to say, because people haven't read the book. She becomes less sympathetic.
Sorry, I won't do my comment.
Yeah, she becomes, well, so, but I think how do you sympathize with characters who are questionable, who do things that you might not approve of? What I will say about Linda, my love for Linda is she's a wonderful mother. She really loves her children. And it was interesting to write her because she is a woman who really kind of takes some risks, and she, shall we say, and she acts out certain things that we won't say. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So when you are writing, how long a period of time do you sit down and write? And what was your query process like?
So I don't like to put in fewer than 3 hours because I think it's hard to kind of get in the headspace. I like to do between 3 and 6 hours. And one of the things I do is I block out time on my phone or computer calendar because I feel like I'm sort of obedient if I block out the time. And my query process was interesting. So I had a draft of Finding Mrs. Ford after a year, and I heard about a writer's conference. And I went to that conference, and in the conference, they had all these different workshops, and they had a chance to, give, I think it was 40 pages to an agent or 40 pages to an editor. So I thought, well, I'll do one of each. And I ended up starting to work with a freelance editor for the next year. And it was really a friend of mine who sent my manuscript as it was to an agent at CAA who fell in love with my writing. And then we did revisions and submissions, and it took 2 more years to sell it. So, long process. Yep.
Back to Linda. Was she based on anyone that you knew?
As I was sitting in Florida, I rewatched the movie Body Heat, which is filmed in Lantana.
Oh, yeah.
Kathleen Turner, William Hurt, and it is film noir. And it's a very good film noir. It's later film noir. It's not in the heyday of film noir. It's in the 80s. And you get this feeling in this movie. It's so visceral. Everybody's hot, and everybody's sweaty, and everybody's bad. They're just bad, bad, bad. So she's a noir heroine where you really should question what she's telling you and what she's up to. And she was influenced by that, not a particular person. And then when you write a character like that, there is fun in just going for what she's doing. Because you're like, whoa, she's going to do it. There she goes.
You seem to weave in a lot of fact when you're writing. Well, I only read Brief Road, but there was a lot of fact in there. And can you tell us how you decided about including the dirty war?
Yeah, so Miguel is Argentine, and I had traveled to Argentina a decade ago with my best friend Ileana Moore, who's half Argentine, and I was absolutely flabbergasted by the detention facility in the middle of Buenos Aires. And what really got me, we're all touched by different things. What got me was in the middle of the city, and as I understood it, these people were rounded up. It was students and leftists and union leaders, and they were hooded, and they were driven what they thought were very far distances. But then they were brought to this facility that was metaphorically right next door to their parents, and it just chilled me that no one knew they were right there. So it stayed with me. And like I said, I like a layered book. And in looking at generational trauma, I think each person really has something in the book. And there's a piece of that Argentine history in Miguel's story. So my friend Ileana and her cousin Marta were my consultants for Argentine expressions and stuff. I speak French. And I speak so Italian, used to be better. I don't really speak Spanish. I can get the gist if I'm looking at it, but you want to be correct that an Argentine would say it and it's not specific to a Mexican or a Spaniard or whatever. So I thank them at the back of the book. And we also went down to Viedma, which I put in the book. They have this ranch in Viedma, which sounds very glamorous. But it's this desiccated acreage, with like dead cows lying there. It was a drought when we were there. And there's this little house with one gaucho and one of those iron stoves that you've seen in Wild West movies. And I was just so taken with it all. And that's the thing, it's kind of all in there, but the facts. So the writer is obsessive. And I allowed myself to go into that kind of obsessive mind, and she's murder obsessed, and she goes on these tangents, and I just find all those things very interesting. So, yeah.
I think that made the book very interesting.
Right.
More so now that you know that it was based on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When you say, you can hear that there's, little chips of your real experiences that you are writing. The middle book, Falls. Was there you in that one? Because
yeah.
And Taft Has that I read quite a bit, and part of a thrill of any reader try to be able to figure out what the twist is going to be. I didn't get that one.
So Ruby Falls, as I said, it's Gothic. It is not youthful Gothic with like vampires and all that. It is Victorian Gothic, if you think about Jane Eyre or The Woman in White, or specifically Rebecca. It is taken from that kind of moody, and I always think of the main thrust of a Gothic story is the damsel in distress. You have a woman, young woman generally, powerless, who comes under the control or influence or sway of a man who has a lot more power than she has. And you don't really know if there is a supernatural thing playing out or not. So the first two chapters of Ruby Falls completely downloaded into my brain one day when I was about to go out the door. And it begins when a little girl, whose name is Ruby, is at a cave in Chattanooga, Tennessee with her father. And the cave is called Ruby Falls. It's a real place, scary place, where they turn off the lights. And she's 6 years old, and she's holding her father's hand. And the tour guide is giving this speech saying, and the divers have dived down, and they've never been able to find the bottom. And she's terrified that she's going to fall in the water, and her dad lets go of her hand. And when the lights come back on, he's gone. Because it's 1968, there's no technology. So the tour guides, they're pretty much sure that this 6-year-old didn't come in alone. They don't remember who brought her in. So by the time they call the police and her mom tracks her down that night, she and her mom are grounded in Chattanooga, Tennessee for the rest of the summer. The mother's dealing with the search and the Inquisition, and the daughter is in a state of what we would now call PTSD. 20 years later, she's grown up to be an actress on a soap opera called The Finger of Fate, which I love that. And she plays the sister of the star. And she is written out, and she's ditched the name Ruby, which was her middle name, and goes by Eleanor Russell. And when she's written out of the show, she takes off for Europe, where she meets, and this is the part that's evocative of Rebecca. She meets Orlando Montague, this tall, dark, handsome stranger, and marries him without knowing him. And that is really the setup of Rebecca. And they go on their honeymoon to Rome, and they're about to go in the catacombs, and she has this attack of claustrophobia. And she knows she should probably tell him what happened to her as a child. But does she? No! So she begins her marriage with a secret. They move to LA. They get the perfect cottage in the Hollywood Hills, and she is cast in a remake of Rebecca on the Paramount lot. So I worked at Paramount, and Orlando starts to change. And he's not as pleasant as he was. He becomes a little snappish, which is also what happened when the unnamed young bride and Max de Winter went back to Manderley. And so you start to unravel what's really going on. The reason I use real places, I love to write Palm Beach or Watch Hill or Los Angeles. I'm a reader who has a huge thrill of recognition. If, what you just said about New York or something, I get excited. I'm thinking, oh, I've seen that. I know Reef Road. And so I thought Hollywood, if you think about Rebecca, the first line is, last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. And you know right away, you don't know what's going on, but whoever's speaking can't go to this place. Is she longing for this place? Does she not want to go back? You're intrigued. And I thought, Hollywood is known to the whole world. We've had more than 100 years of American movies. We know what it looks like. You don't have to have ever been there. And after I left Hollywood, I had over, many year period, 3 very close friends die. So when I had a daughter move back there, right when I was starting to write this book, it felt like a ghost town when I would visit her. If you've lived here for 20 years and you had something bad happen to you 15 years ago at the CVS, you don't cry every time you pass CVS because you pass it 5 times a day. You've sort of desensitized. But if you go back to a place where you haven't been, it becomes sort of memory lane. My daughter's pediatrician was Paul Fleiss. Remember Heidi Fleiss? I love Dr. Fleiss. Some of you might not remember them. But so I went back to LA, and I'm driving down the street with Tess, and I'm like, oh, Tessie, look, that was your pediatrician's office. She's like, yeah, Mom, it's okay. So I wanted to capture that essence of a place. And the Hollywood Hills felt almost real, but a little dreamy.
This was great.
Thank you. It won a Plot Twist Award. Thank you. The Best Plot Twist Award.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
You was anyway.
Yeah. And I think probably we need to stop, right? Thank you all. It's really been a pleasure. I appreciate it.